if there's a white population that's been settled for 1,000 years in a particular location, then surely they have the same rights to protecting their identity and protecting their land an indigenous tribe has elsewhere. But the UN's argument on this, and the kind of protections that the UN preserves for indigenous cultures, pretty much specifically exclude white people anywhere. We've literally had judges saying, well, this person doesn't understand this kind of social rules in our civilization around this kind of stuff, and in their culture it's much more normal to rape children. The small nations can't take the burden of the entire world, and you can't tell people who aren't rich in those nations that we're rich enough to deal with this and cope with this, and it's actually beneficial, because they know it isn't. They experience that it isn't. And the more that their leaders insist on it and refuse to protect them from it, the more those people will be turned off from legitimate courses of response.
I'm Dr. Randy Bach, and I'm honored today to have with us Daniel Jupp. He's the acerbic, clairvoyant, astute writer from the country of Jupplandia, which is on Substack someplace, and he lives in the UK. And Daniel is one of my favorite authors, I got to say also. He recently wrote FCK with an asterisk, The Planet, on globalism, and he's the author of The Gates of Hell on Bill Gates, and the sensible aspect of that title, as well as a book on Marxism. You tell me the title of that one, please.
That's called A Gift for Treason, The Cultural Marxist Assault on Western Civilization, and that was my first one.
So, Daniel, how did you get to be so brilliant and wise?
It's something to do with the water here. I don't know what it is, but no, it's very nice of you, and it's a very nice introduction. But one of the things I sort of say quite often is a lot of the stuff I write and I think I believe is kind of fairly common sense, and it's just the point we've got to in history where respectable views and alternative views have become so divorced from reality and so delusional that basic kind of levels of knowledge and common sense, which is all I kind of claim to have, maybe stand out a little bit.
It's a funny thing. On a personal basis, I went through my childhood being, I've got brothers and we're pretty gruff. And so I only thought I was an idiot, because that's all my brother ever told me I was. And, I was an okay student and whatnot. But I went to good schools and whatnot. And only later on, people are like, oh my God, you're so this and so that and whatnot. I'm going to leave the adjectives out. And I don't think it's really like intelligence per se, maybe more like, kind of chewing things over a little bit and looking at root causes and comparing things. So, I'm kind of known as a guy who makes a lot of analogies. I put things up and then I compare it to something else. Our childhood instincts are to kind of take something and put it in your mouth. You want to feel it and run it around, put your tongue over it. And we do that as babies. And I think we kind of, not that you want to do that to everything that comes along as an adult, but metaphorically, I think you have to kind of like have that ability to process and see what things are and what their similarities are to other things you might have come across. And I think you have that really facility and faculty to do so. And it's a rarity. I'm wondering, why is that rare? Is everyone just kind of bought and paid for, in the regular press and whatnot? The USAID charade or charade, however you guys pronounce it, seems to me that point out that a lot of what we're seeing is just kind of the king's men. That's kind of like the emperor's new clothes. There's a whole courtier class who maybe are, in a sense, courtesans that they have been kind of bought and paid for.
Oh, I mean, you raise an awful lot there. In terms of education, I think one of the problems is we've gone through a process, and this has been over centuries of specialization, standardization, and indoctrination. So, if you wanted to immediately find the cause for why someone can be quite brilliant in one area and quite stupid in another, it's the degree to which our educational system is specialized. So, we don't have that many Renaissance men floating about, and we don't have the kind of really that was functioning up to the Enlightenment era or functioning during the Renaissance. This idea that someone's individual knowledge could be comprehensive. There's so much information out there, and obviously with the advent of computing and the internet and the ready availability of all kinds of sources of information, you've got this kind of vast panorama where the sum total of knowledge is greater than it once was, but the capacity of the individual to process it all is much less. So what we do is we funnel people through a schooling system that effectively selects for them what they will learn and what they will think and how they will approach topics. And that's all well and good if your educational system is governed by people with good intent, or people who are themselves knowledgeable and kind of wise in their selections. And it's nothing more than indoctrination if it isn't.
Yeah, and it's kind of like an in-group, out-group thing. In medicine, my mother, I wanted to be this, I wanted to be that, I want to be a fireman, an astronaut, all that kind of stuff. But I had broken, well, I kind of severed a finger at one point, and it was miraculously put on. You can't really tell which one it is. It was done so nicely, and that was a kind of a revelation for me. I was like 5 or 6 years old at the time, and at that point, I said, "Oh my God, I want to be a surgeon. I want to be a doctor." And when I went on to want to be this or that, my mother kept reminding me, like you said, you're going to be a doctor. And so it was kind of like a pride and a prize to be that, because doctors were held in such high esteem. And along the
Yeah.
way, it took a lot of work and effort to be one, and to keep being one over time and whatnot. It's not wasn't always necessarily what maybe my best proclivities might have warranted. Maybe I should have been a kind of a computer guy or a math guy or I don't know, maybe a car mechanic. I have no idea. But that the doctoring is kind of thing that stuck. But along the way, it's kind of been disappointing. COVID was a huge disappointment in seeing what doctors think, if in fact they think. And again, this kind of brings up the point of whether you are in the military, or whether you're a critic. I think a fair amount of doctors, turns out, under COVID, were following kind of the military orders from above. But we didn't have, aside from, maybe the Surgeon General and whatnot, a few people in the Public Health Corps, we don't have actual ranks and whatnot. We're supposed to be independent thinking individuals, and we're supposed to be treating the patient. And that's, the doctor-patient relationship, not the doctor-society, the not doctor-government relationship. But across all the various other different silos that you kind of mentioned of these specializations or specialities, people have been following the group, the herd, rather than their own, scent on the matter, their own scent and sensibility, to misuse Jane Austen. And, so I'm at the stage now where, I've got a little bit of the gray thing going, and I'm sort of, I was a primary care doctor working for myself. So I always started to, think about how, this would work for my business, for my patients, for my own relations, for my own mind and my mindset. And so I've always been looking at these things from COVID and whatever the problem happens to be, whether it's blood pressure, cholesterol, from my own perspective. But that unfortunately seemed like a rarity. Is kind of an aspect that is endemic to society's annealing, not just kneeling, but annealing. Kind of when they coalesce, they coagulate into these blobs that are functionary. So we have kind of like these, kind of these mercantile associations, like in the Hanseatic League, that form their own groups and look out for their own interests rather than those for whom theoretically they proclaim their subservience or their devotion.
Well, even without direct corruption, so even without the kind of things that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has spoken about in relation to the capture of uh, watchdog bodies by pharmaceutical companies, um, and the payment of individual doctors by pharmaceutical companies. The fact that during COVID, if someone identified a patient with COVID, then they received a payment from the state, and an additional payment. Um, we've got these things which are clearly corrupt that are going on, one of the through established professions, where people who are of linked companies, linked kind of mercantile interests, if you like, they have a reason to pay those people and fund those people to give particular responses. And we see it with net zero, climate change. We see it with the kind of medical professional response to COVID. Um, at the same time, you've got the operation of just really the groupthink of the profession, and the profession protecting itself from outside voices, because it's not just someone's finances that are benefited from going along with the kind of majority opinion, and what happens to suit corporate sponsors of that majority opinion. It's also someone's professional status that's on the line. And we saw that people who bucked the trend, people who were maybe in positions of expertise and authority, were in danger of losing their jobs or losing their medical license if they went against the swiftly established consensus, which happened to be a corrupt one.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing thing. So you've been able to kind of be, you know, stay out on your own. Do you get kind of this, you know, whack a mole? The nail that stands out gets hammered the most.
Um, Well, I mean, I'm kind of fortunate in that I'm from a working class background. I've got a very ordinary life. Although there are increasing, um, not just efforts but accomplishments of censorship in the UK, and everyone is aware of how much the current government cracked down on things that they consider dangerous, which quite often are things that are truthful. Um, Despite all that, I didn't have a lot to lose during COVID. I wasn't a doctor, I wasn't a medical professional. I felt that the fact that I wasn't engaged in the system allowed me to tell the truth more. And I think that's the case with a lot of people who spoke up. The less you have to lose professionally, and I wasn't in the kind of job where I'd get immediately censured or fired for speaking out. Then the more freedom you have to say what you consider to be the truth.
No, absolutely. There's interesting things going on in the UK. Um, I just one of my favorite voices out there is Douglas Murray, and you had some recent thoughts on his interaction with, I think, comedian Dave Smith, and maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of the voice of the expert and whatnot. And you're not an expert, I'm not an expert, but we have voices. His is larger than ours. Um, what do you think about kind of how much expertise is needed to be entering the conversation?
Well, I think we need to distinguish between technical knowledge and general knowledge. And for me, politics and history comes under general knowledge, and not just general knowledge, but knowledge that is good for every adult to have, and that every adult should have to be engaged in their society. So, um, when someone's asked to make correct political choices or correct moral choices, and to know something of the history of which they speak, they aren't being asked to be a credentialed expert. They're being asked to be an adult, and as an adult, they should know these things. And I was totally on Douglas Murray's side in terms of his attitude to David Smith and the things that David Smith has said, and his attitude to Israel and how we should respond to, the disgusting atrocities that were committed against Israel. So morally and historically as well, I felt that the facts and the morality was on Douglas Murray's side, and I felt that for a long time. But unfortunately, on the Rogan show, what Murray did is he didn't attack the positions that Dave Smith takes from the point of view of greater historical knowledge or a more accurate morality. He attacked them on the grounds of quite ridiculous logical fallacies, which was a really unfortunate thing to do. And I've got into argument with some of the people who follow me and some of the people who normally agree with me by pointing out that Douglas Murray put in a very poor performance there. And I don't think he served the cause very well in that encounter, because you cannot begin with logical fallacies like you have to visit a region to comment on a region, or you have to be an expert to be able to comment on a region. That handed the high ground, the intellectual high ground, to people who are far less intellectual than Murray is himself. And it kind of gave Dave Smith and Joe Rogan the ammunition they needed, and kind of really deflected from the fact that I do think that Israel is in the right, and I do think that Murray is in the right, and I think that Murray could have supplied arguments that prove that based on the history, but he didn't do that. And it's similarly with Murray's attitude to Churchill. I think people like Dave Smith who denigrate Churchill are morally obscene when they do so. And they're morally obscene when they, kind of blame Jews for wars that are created out of attacks on Jews. But Murray, as an informed person, as a expert, he had a responsibility to tackle those problems and those kind of false narratives by delivering the truth, by delivering what is factually accurate, and not by saying only certain kinds of people or a certain caste of people is allowed to talk on these things, because that's a terrible argument in itself.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's kind of the extreme. There's a comedian, I think his name's Ryan Long. Um, I find entertaining, and he had somewhat of the opposite take I just saw happen today. He's out on the street. He's kind of living with his parents, and maybe works part time as a barista or something like that, and hanging around, say, kind of suave Brooklyn. But he opines about everything because he says, I fixed the Ukraine war this morning, but nobody's listening to me, all that kind of stuff. He just can't really work out his own finances and whatnot. So, that's kind of the, a weird way of poking fun at everyone having an opinion about everything. On the other hand, there is the kind of the happy medium um, of getting enough information on hand and then trying to attack the problem and dealing with it without having to sit in Gaza City per se, with a flak jacket on in order to make an opinion. I mean, there's sometimes you can be too close to a problem and you get invested in the people. I think we see that with UNRWA, with UNRWA, with its unrelenting support for Hamas and its unrelenting, flaccid attitude and whatnot, because they're like embedded, but on the wrong side. So they're not just embedded, but they're in bed with some of the people they monitor. So Murray's
Absolutely. People can definitely be too close to it, and that distorts the vision just as much as ignorance of it does.
Yeah. So it's a funny thing, but since we're kind of quasi on the top, we'll come back to Churchill. But since we're on the topic a little bit of Hamas and whatnot, I was mentioning in the green room that as a kid I had this revelation. Maybe I was studying, and I wasn't a kid, I was an adult, I think it might have been through biology or whatever, phagocytosis, which is, one body like an amoeba eating another thing, like an amoeba engulfing a bacterium and, chewing it down and whatnot. And I was struck at the time, because the troubles were going on in Ireland, the UK as well, and Northern Ireland, with, the map of Ireland, having this little, piece that it kind of wants to encompass and take over, and make itself whole, as it were. That accomplished, kind of mission accomplished. There's been peace there, but all the efforts they went through seemed to be for naught. I'll give you one quick side example. I was at a cocktail party in the before times, before COVID, probably 2017 or 18, and it was supported by by Catalonia, which is a nice piece of Spain, and they want to be their own country and whatnot. So I was speaking with the putative, next consulate from Catalonia or whatever. So what are your dreams? Well, let's say you got Catalonia, it separates and becomes its own country. What do you want? Well, the first thing we want to do is join the EU. Like, and so,
yeah.
So I was like, well, okay, so let me get this straight. You want to spend all these, centuries or whatever getting out from the, Castilian yoke in order to be Catalonia, and then just get your marching orders from Brussels, from
Yeah.
whatever her name is up there. And it's like, how is that like Catalan? I mean, and he didn't really have an answer for me, but it just seems to me that the same thing has happened in a sense to Ireland. So they've been Irish, and you actually have a great exegesis, which has nothing to do with the X of Jesus, which might be pertinent in this case. But the stories of the troubles, from the early 20th century to point, but are they protesting against the loss of this Irish flavor, of the Irishness of Ireland, which has only 5 million Irish or something like that, and taken in like 1 million so far, maybe a couple million people who are not? How does this all work out? And then we'll kind of segue into the contraposition to the kind of Palestinian terror cause.
Yeah, well, the kind of Catalonian situation is, as you described, very, very odd that they want to join the EU after fighting to be separate from Spain, and but at least there's slightly larger distances involved there. The British Isles are quite small, and the distances involved, would fit many times over within a single US state. Um, and yet obviously the division between mainland Britain and Ireland has been one of the most contentious and violent and long-standing disagreements, in Western Europe. Um, uh, and again, I think you can get much more accurate about it than most people are. But when I wrote a piece on the current Irish situation, I think I was, very sympathetic towards um, people like Conor McGregor and people who want to assert Irishness. And I do believe that um, if you have an ethnic identity that's traditionally linked to a homeland, you do have the right to assert yourself in that homeland. And you have the right to want your way of life, your culture, your identity protected and preserved. And, that tends to be a right that we kind of extend now and consider should be extended to people maybe outside Europe, but don't extend to people within Europe. Um, and, we kind of say, the UN has very strict guidelines on what a indigenous culture is and the need to protect an indigenous culture. The guidelines on what that is and the necessity of protecting an indigenous people are framed in such a way that they kind of automatically exclude every white population, no matter how long they've been settled in a given region. And it's kind of obvious what's going on there and how unjust that is, because if there's a white population that's been settled for 1,000 years or 6,000 years or 4,000 years in a particular location, then surely they have the same rights to protecting their identity and protecting their land and protecting their space that an indigenous tribe has elsewhere. But the UN's argument on this, and the kind of protections that the UN preserves for indigenous cultures, pretty much specifically exclude white people anywhere, because they don't meet the criteria that are set around the concept of indigenous. Um, so that's an issue, and I think that you know what's happening to Ireland has been a scale of immigration that is bound to destroy Irish identity, and Conor McGregor's right on that. So I'm quite sympathetic in the task of any Irish person saying we need to preserve our identity, and you know there is a traditional people linked to this land who have the right to this land. Um, and when governments of a place are deliberately acting against that, they're going to get resistance, and they're going to get people kind of rising up against it. Because, you know, if you're a village of 700 people, and suddenly there's a facility being built to house 800 arrivals from other countries, and they're asylum seekers, and they're being paid for by your taxes, and, you know, this vast building goes up, um, you know, it's utterly absurd of globalist leaders throughout the Western world to pretend that that's somehow okay, and pretend that people should support that, because of course they're not going to support it. You know, and of course they're going to see that as a threat to their way of life and their identity, because they're outnumbered. You know, in that particular place, they are being outnumbered. And you know, Ireland has quite a low population. There's only 5 million odd people, and you know, and so if you import tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, you're going to get a pushback on it. And it's the same in, you know, mainland Britain. We have imported. We're currently running at an importation rate of about 1 million people a year. We've got up between 700 and 1,000 people landing on the coast in dinghies every day. Well, you know, the British Army only has 13 regiments, each of, you know, 700 odd people. Um, we're getting, every 14 days, we're getting a number of people who land on our coast who outnumber the British Army. You know, you cannot tell people on a small island that this is sensible and this is sane, and that they're racist and xenophobic and hideous people if they worry about it and if they object to it. You know, especially when they see public services collapsing, when they see you know, facilities that they use being strained, and services that they use being strained. You know, you can't have a welfare state and at the same time offer that welfare to everybody who comes in immediately and expect it to continue. You know, the small nations can't take the burden of the entire world, and that's true of Ireland, and it's true of the UK. And you can't tell people who aren't rich in those nations that we're rich enough to deal with this and cope with this, and it's actually beneficial, because they know it isn't. They experience that it isn't. And, you know, the more that their leaders insist on it and refuse to protect them from it, the more those people will be turned off from, you know, legitimate courses of response. So, you know, in Ireland's case, I have huge sympathy for that. But you're also right. One of the very strange things in Ireland's case is that they spent centuries trying to remove the yoke of British rule. And they spent centuries saying, we refuse to be ruled from London. Well, Sinn Féin are fully on board for the globalist project of replacing the Irish people now. You know, they go along with it. And they were saying, if we're ruled from London, that's so hideous that we've got to bomb innocent women and children. And that was their platform, their policy, their background. But at the same time now, they say, you know, actually, Irish people who complain about being replaced, we're the nationalist party, but we're not going to speak for those people. So in those instances, what you see is even groups that were so passionate about nationalism in the past that they were the political wings of terrorist groups, um, seem now to be globalist. and seem now to be saying to their people, you're not allowed to have a different identity. Well, what do they think that will generate? These people who have been terrorists themselves in the past, where do they think these people that you're refusing to listen to will go?
I don't know. um, it's just an oddity. I remember the kind of the idyllic era of the UK. I was there in the late 1970s, and then again in the 80s and so forth. And I spent some time, a few months in London. Um, Much cleaner place. It was, it was a working place. I mean, it was a workable place. I'm sure they had their labor issues and their strikes and whatnot. But you didn't, it was a clean place. You didn't see graffiti. I'd grown up in New York City, and we were kind of ahead of the curve on all the multi-culti stuff there. And in the, my time is 1960s and 70s, New York City, and a lot of it was a pit. It was very dangerous, and a lot of muggings, and the whole kind of esprit de corps was not there. We had kind of a restoration under Giuliani in the late 90s. I wasn't there at the time, and so forth. And New York City kind of reclaimed the mantle as a reasonable place to be. People wanted to be there, and values went up, and kind of the whole ambiance changed, and it changed downward when we got De Blasio, and kind of, I think he was a member of the Communist Party at one point, if not a kind of a fellow traveler and whatnot. But the sensibility that the other is to be valued, the other, and it's not you, and it's a kind of a funny cheat code, as the gamers say, for society to have this way where you yourself is not you are not valued, and some other that is better. I understand the aspirational part. We are fallen creatures, and we look to God, as a way of purifying and divining our views and our sensibilities and our society and whatnot. But the other, has been transmuted and transmitted as somebody else. Kind of like in movies, there's like a homeless guy who's always the sage. You're making mistakes, but somebody, there's I think Spike Lee called it the magical black, but it can be anybody, and it could be the magical Sikh, or whatever. It's somebody else who's got this better wisdom. But does that actually play out in their own society? I mean, you look at India; they've got like rivers of trash, oftentimes and whatnot, and people are leaving places that are failed, and then they're coming to someplace else, that has had success, but they're forgetting how that success happened. Diversity is our strength is a nice slogan, but like many slogans like affirmative action and whatnot, I think they cloud the actual meaning. The safest place, I went to, was Nantucket, island, and people have to have an island sensibility. And if you steal something, you're not going to get that far. In the UK, when I was there back in the day, there was that same kind of sensibility. People looked out for each other, and they had a cohesion and a friendliness. I think you get away from that when you have anomie, which is kind of lawlessness. But I also like kind of a French mispronunciation of that, which would be like namelessness. You're without your name. You're walking around, and you're kind of all semi-fluid as ball bearings. You can move around, but you don't have any characteristic that kind of ties you in with the others around you.
Well, all the social evidence that's available suggests that cultures that are homogenous are more peaceful than cultures that aren't. And if you look at the history of nations, the nations that descend into conflict, internal conflict on a very large scale, frequently are the nations where competing ethnic groups are artificially placed together. So nations which are constructed with artificial boundaries rather than ones that have naturally developed over time. For example, that's disastrous. This is why, they call it Balkanization. This is why the Balkans was one of the worst regions in the world for conflict, because you have lots of competing ethnic and tribal groups in the same place. What we've done in the modern era is nations that were homogenous, nations that were peaceful, are artificially recreating out of ideology the situation of the Balkans. So we turn very peaceful, very high trust societies, and lots of the things that kind of Western civilization did that were considered beneficial and kind and empathetic were based on a high trust society where people are fairly similar, have the same culture, the same values, the same language, the same religion, and if you have all that, you can accommodate and incorporate people who integrate very easily. You know, and especially if you're culturally self-confident and you're prepared to say, look, as uh, as Teddy Roosevelt did. We're talking about this issue in America. Even a nation that's been formed of people from very different origins. Theodore Roosevelt said, we only have place for Americans. If you're coming here and you have an identity that is separate to America and you prioritize that identity above America, then you're not an American. you know and someone could have a very strong identity that they still feel loyalty to, but not above the American identity, and that's the only way it works.
No, I agree. I mean, there was a Andrew Clavin. I listened to Andrew Clavin's podcast, and I can't remember his guest's last name. That was a couple of weeks ago, but he was pointing out that akin to what you say oftentimes, um, that there are people who have a home and the people whose home is the world. He said it more succinctly than that. People who are tied to a place. So if you have a shop, you're a car mechanic, that's your place. If you are John Kerry, you can be working off your laptop anyway, anywhere, anyhow, um, and you're equally at home in Davos as I don't know, Oslo or whatever. So there are people who can kind of mingle and be the kind of corpuscles of the global order. And the other people who have to kind of make a living and who are getting fed and tied to a place and tied to relationships and whatnot. Um, and so they're kind of the fabric, they're salt of the earth, as it were. Um, but their earth has been salted and as
Yeah.
salt.
Yeah, well, I mean that's the somewheres and anywheres theory, and it's been particularly made a problem because um, the somewheres tend to be people who are lower down the social scale and have less money and influence. And the anywheres, the people who say, I'm a citizen of the world and none of this stuff matters and open borders are not a problem to worry about. And, you know, we benefit from drawing in millions of people from other nations and it's racist to say otherwise. Those people tend to be at the top of our society. They're protected from the effects. They're insulated by a bubble of wealth. They move in social circles that are international quite often. And that applies to our political leaders. It applies to our religious leaders, even. And it applies to that middle and upper class section of people, including most journalists, who are themselves financially comfortable, themselves unlikely to be living in the areas that are negatively impacted by mass immigration, and themselves who tend to be, through university teaching and through the kind of social ties they have, more loyal to general principles or transnational bodies or this idea that we're all one big happy human family. Now, when you've got a leadership that's functioning by this idea we're one big happy human family and everyone's the same, and you've got ordinary people who want you to be loyal to your country and loyal to its own existing populace, those things aren't that compatible, especially when the people at the top are saying we're going to open the borders, we're going to, in America's case, Biden brought in 15 to 20 million people, which is, even in a nation as large as the US, is insane. And you've now got, the kind of lawfare of judges, Democrat judges, saying it's xenophobic, it's racist, it's un-American to remove those people, even if they're dangerous gangbangers who are only ever going to prey on existing American citizens. Somehow they are entitled to due process and due rights and all the kind of benefits of your civilization, whereas your own existing citizens, whatever their colour and race and background, aren't entitled to those things. There's more due process offered to South American gangbangers than at the moment than there is to the people that were arrested by Joe Biden's administration for attending J6. The J6 people didn't get a right to a fair trial. They didn't get a right to a swift trial. They didn't get any of the due process that is now being demanded for non-Americans. And people see that, ordinary people see that. Doesn't matter whether you're in Britain or France or Germany or the US. When a kind of ruling class and an establishment viewpoint is very clearly fetishizing and in love with anyone foreign and contemptuous and dismissive of anyone who happens to already be an American or already be French or already be German or already be English or Canadian. Ordinary people see that and they know that the system is not on their side. And you're taking away your kind of their legal rights of response. If they protest about it, they're clamped down on much more readily and much more swiftly than, say, a Black Lives Matter protest group or a pro-Hamas protest group will be clamped down on, if they're clamped down on at all. And people see that two-tier set of standards, and they see that the one of the passports for being respectable now in our society, one of the passports in Western society for being considered the kind of voice that gets on telly and should be heard, is seemingly having this hatred of your own people and doing things which will injure and harm them. And, importing lots of people from very different, often very violent cultures is one of those things.
No, it's crazy. It's crazy. There's this concept of the magic soil, or whatever it's called, where you bring somebody over from Syria into, I don't know, Leicester, England. He's going to turn into a proper Englishman, drink tea.
Yes, suddenly transformed. Yeah, and that's not how it works.
Love Monty Python or something like that, and sit around.
Yeah, and how it actually works is that you have a culture that's self-confident, and you have a culture that's prepared to say, if we accept you into our country, as you would accepting someone into your family, you're not going to be happy if your daughter marries someone who steals from you, or if they marry someone who decides to take a dump on the living room carpet. That person who comes into your family has to have some regard for you. They or if they beat your daughter, in front of you, no family is going to be happy with that. And similarly, no existing populace is going to be happy with people who come into that nation and treat it with disrespect, treat it with disregard, constantly belittle and berate it and refuse to adapt to its existing culture and norms. Why should they accept that? None of us should have to accept that.
I think you make a great example. I ran a mayoral candidate into the ground. No, I was kidding. We were the underdogs. So we were running a Republican candidacy in blue state, Massachusetts, in my local leafy suburb. And we actually did well. We beat one of the other candidates in a multi-candidate race, but we didn't pass the next bar. But anyway, one of the things that I was writing about at the time was the way the city. It's a slightly different topic, but the way the city makes contracts. And comparing it to your own home. At the time, we were doing I don't know, kitchen renovation, whatever. And so we got all these bids. We compared results. We talked to other people. Anyway, and then we had to decide what we wanted, what we could get. And we wanted this, great thing, but we can only afford this slightly different version. And so we had to live within a budget. We had to kind of plan it out. We had to make money. We had to, I don't know, all these things that never happen with the actual city budgeting, where they're kind of stuck. I mean, their major expenditure is the schools, and they have to pay a certain amount because of the unions and whatnot. And coincidentally, I was at a party at that time, which is memorable because there was a young lass, she was in her 40s, whatever, and she was working in the schools, administrator, and she was going to be selected to be the principal of one of the elementary schools. So one of the city's, I don't know, 30, 25, 30 different schools. And she's like, oh my God, I hope my guy, that she didn't know I was, kind of the apparatus, whatever, behind this candidate. He said, I hope he doesn't get in, because if he doesn't, he wants to put these jobs up for bid, and then I'm not going to be able to get my basically padded, 30, 40% higher than what would be standard, because, everyone's kind of like creeping along. They're all part of the system. And so they're on the ins. And so they're like the ins and the outs. You call them somewheres, the anywheres. She's kind of an anywhere. She could get that job anywhere else, whatnot. But she's here because, it's all part of the system that doesn't work the same way you would run your own household. So when you're talking about, having somebody come in, and they crap on your rug, we have actually had individuals in our household who did that. We call them our pets. We had a series of dogs over the years, and every now and then they do that kind of stuff. You don't put up with that kind of behavior. If you did it on a repetitive basis, that's a dog that doesn't hang around, a dog that bites your hand, whatever. Get tested for rabies or whatever. We in euphemistic way, we put them down. So I've had company in my house.
In the 19th century, there was a French symbolist poet who trained his dog to do the opposite of what other dogs are trained for. So he trained the dog to randomly bite people. He rewarded it when it randomly bit people. He, trained the dog to defecate anywhere. He rewarded it when it did so. And this is what our culture does at the moment. We take, this is literally what Democrat regions have done in Democrat cities. They've said, well, okay, instead of saying that looting stores is wrong, we are going to legalize looting stores. We're going to say that, unless it's $500 or more, you're allowed to do that, and that's fine. What do they expect the response to be? But they don't care, because, this is primarily affecting areas where the people who make these kind of anti-rules don't live. But they're the representatives of those areas, supposedly, and they're going, well, actually, we think it's terribly unfair on ethnic communities, immigrant communities, to ask them not to steal stuff. So, an awful lot of them get arrested for stealing stuff. Which must be racist.
The now late Michael Gerson, who wrote for the first George Bush, I believe, and maybe the second, as a speechwriter and whatnot, he called it the soft bigotry of low expectations. That you can't possibly expect this other group to understand all this stuff. And then mind you, that means you're calling them idiots. You're calling them morally defective. They can't figure out, don't defecate in the street, don't do this, whatever. And even if they did that somehow back in their own region, well, it's not here. Don't do it here. I mean, people enter our house here and there. We've had parties and they're all taking their shoes off. I'm like, no, you don't have to do that. We don't really. We vacuum. We keep our shoes on. Not an issue for us. But conversely, I go to some other some other people's homes and they expect us to take our shoes off. So I bring some slippers or whatever when I go to their houses, whatever, because that's their house. I mean, there's actually a great skit. I can't remember it's a British comedian. He's trying to do it quick. He's at his friend's house and the guy's cooking. And it's like, what are you making? So I'm making the lentil stew with the carrot, this and that. He says, I'm not a vegetarian. He says, oh, yeah. He says, well, how come you're not making any meat dishes? So, well, we're vegetarians. It's like, no, I got that. But when you came to my house, we purposely, did vegetarian to accommodate you. I figured when I come to your house, you're going to make me something with meat. But it always seems to be like a one-way thing. So the vegetarian seems like an intersectionality aspect. He can't violate his vegetarianism or his veganism for the meat guy, but the meat guy is always supposed to accede to the vegetarian guy, and this seems to be kind of
Yeah, and possibly that hypocrisy would be sustainable on that level, but it's not sustainable on the level of where I come from. We rape children quite often, and it's perfectly normal, you know.
You're putting that
And
in
then
here. I'm going to
and
put
then
your quotes over
and
that
then
for you.
kind of what is demanded of the working class by the upper class in Western nations now is that we should all somehow go, oh, okay. We've literally had judges saying, well, this person doesn't understand this kind of social rules in our civilization around this kind of stuff, and in their culture, it's much more normal to rape
Right,
children.
but
So we've got to
somehow he
take that
figured out.
into account.
Yeah. Somehow he figured out how to get to your country, and he decided he wanted to be there on some level. And then what? If I made the
Yeah,
trip over
I
to,
mean,
I don't know,
but we have literally had that being taken into account, unfamiliarity with the Western notion that you don't rape children has been taken into account in cases by existing judges. And you have to say that is not only utterly insane, it's completely evil. But
yeah,
it's
it is.
actually happened. You wouldn't write it as a spoof. You would say, I'm going too far, this is ridiculous. But this is
Yeah,
what's happened.
no, it's a sadness. So we didn't get to cover everything, um, but we're kind of rounding out our hour here. I want to be able to have people see your books, so I'm going to put them up here briefly. Um, Maybe you can tell us the title of this book here. Um,
Yeah, that's F the Planet, which is my latest one. And that one's very much like from the perspective of talking about what ordinary people should do if they've got a globalist government. So, how to resist the Great Reset in the Trump era. Obviously, America's had the huge benefit, in my eyes, of a second Trump administration, but they're facing, an awful lot of opposition still in their very sensible attempts to protect the American people. Um, but in places like Britain, we've got more and more censorship. We've got more and more crackdown on correct and truthful attitudes, and we've got more and more police and judicial siding with invaders, effectively. And that's true throughout Europe, and it's particularly a problem in relation to how Islam is treated and how the behaviour of imported Muslim communities is dealt with. Um, so, uh, my book is about how you protect yourself there. Really, the most recent one, because sadly, the police are not on your side, the authorities are not on your side, the government you have is usually not on your side. So, there's um, things that you have to do in terms of how you talk, how you act, in relation to the authorities. That there you've got to protect yourself from them as well as from any violent groups that join your nation.
you know. So we have another of your books here. I've actually been told I somewhat look like the guy at a certain point, um, but no relation.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think that's unfair on you, Randy.
uh,
Um, yeah, so the second book is kind of taking a specific example of a globalist. Bill Gates is very much someone who would believe in that we're all citizens of the world kind of concept. Um, and so what I do in that book is I trace the sort of networks of power that Bill Gates has accumulated and the essentially malign influence he's had. Obviously, that was most evident during COVID, but he's also a big backer of net zero, pretty much any kind of globalist project that is going to harm ordinary people or has a kind of noble intent affixed to it supposedly, but is actually going to have malign consequences. Bill Gates is involved in that. So I kind of discuss lots of different areas, from green policy and net zero through to pharmaceutical companies, related to Bill Gates's involvement.
Yeah, good stuff. So just to kind of round out the triad here, I have not read this book. The other two I have, so I owe you an apology there.
Well, yes, you do,
This is a
and I'm assuming there'd be an immediate purchase after we've finished speaking. Uh, but yeah, that's my first book, and that was much more an overview, because what I found is that people were talking about Western civilization without defining it, and people were talking about all the different groups that really dislike the West and have worked against the West, including university educated people from our own upper classes, um, without really defining who they were and what they believed. So that book was an attempt to do both. It was pretty ambitious because it gives an overview of really 2,500 years of Western civilization, and then it gives an overview of cultural Marxism, which is the historical viewpoint of hating the West, blaming the West, considering all the kind of unique Western social features as bad ones. So it discusses all of that kind of thinking that goes into this fetishization of the other, and a denigration of your own people, which we spoke about
I think the
earlier.
themes, I think the three tie together in certain aspects. Um, uh, it's I'll try to come up with the right answer for that, but you know, but I think fetishization of the other somehow, the grass is always greener, um, and there's all phrases like liberal is a person who won't take his own side in an argument, or somebody whose mind is so open his brains have fallen out. It's a sadness, but people can find and help support you through Jupplandia, which I think um, should supplant Finlandia as the most popular and knowledge and famous landia out there. It's a nice little island within the interweb, and you put out salient, perspicacious pieces on a near daily basis. I am a subscriber, and if people want to follow me on Substack, by the way, I have my own little thing here. It's brand new, but I don't really want to emphasize that. But your work is just great on a day-to-day basis. There
Yeah,
must be.
I've got over 400 articles on there now. Thank you, Randy. I've got over 400 articles on there now. Most of them are free. You can scroll through and access any of them. Um, I tend to do one paid one a week, and I really appreciate people who take out a paid subscription, because that really helps me. I'm not someone who's being paid by globalist billionaires to say what I say. So really, my income comes primarily from ordinary people who have similar views to me, who back me on Substack.
And
So
extraordinary and extraordinary people who have similar views. You don't want to,
yes, such as yourself, Randy.
yeah, you don't want to just have the ordinary people. Now, people who do follow you are extraordinary, and you are as
Yeah.
well. Everyone's special, everyone's above average, all that kind of stuff. So, if people want to help support my work here, they can go out and buy my book. It's Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. We're not going to spend much time talking about it now. It's even better not only buy it if they want to read it. Daniel's one of my readers. And
Yes, and it's a very good book, and I think important for showing a kind of preliminary test case for how everything went down during COVID.
yeah, no, I agree. I wish it had come out earlier. I'm probably going to have a Substack piece on this shortly. I had a conversation with the erstwhile editors of Jama, which is the number 2 or 3 medical journal in the world, early 2020, and they saw my piece and they're like really interested and want to put it out. I said, "There's a little coronavirus thing coming around the corner. We're going to wait till that kind of blows over in a few weeks and then put your thing out." And
Yeah,
I said, "Well, one has nothing to do with the other. I said, well, one has nothing to do with the other. I think you could put it out now. Zika is a totally different thing, and they're like, yeah, well, if we put it out now, it might. This is a quote, as best I remember. He said, if we put it out now, it might sow doubt in the public health establishment. Like, okay. He says, well, that's a
Yeah,
bad thing to
yeah.
do. Why is that a bad thing to do? I mean, your job is not to cheerlead. Your job is to be, kind of a tribunal. And if Dr. Fauci, for instance, did some things wrong during Zika, shouldn't we know? We're the consumers of those, results and theories. I mean, yeah, he says, well,
I
yeah,
think that's I mean that really shows the problem, doesn't it? Because that's about, and I think this has become the case in many professional bodies and in many many mainstream people uh, who are of a certain class. The problem is that they want to protect the reputation of institutions, even if those institutions are doing wrong, more than they want to protect
yeah,
ordinary people and the average citizen.
yeah. I got to tell you this one.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, one funny part before we finish. I mean, I used to be talking about fetishization, fetishizing, whatever. There's a fetish, like voodoo and whatnot. And I'm not saying I had one. I'm not saying I did anything because I hadn't even thought of it. But those two guys on that phone call with me in early 2020, Howard Bauschner and Edward Livingston, I presume, Dr. Livingston, I presume,
Yeah,
they were the two erstwhile medical. Well, one was the chief, and the other one's the chief medical editor of JAMA. They both did seppuku or harikiri. They had to do woke suicide because within months, like during the 2020 George Floyd riots, Livingston said, "Look, I don't see color thing. I have a surgical case. I'm treating the
yeah,
patient. I'm treating the numbers. Your BUN, your various levels. I have to get your gallbladder. That's what I see. I don't. The color I see is when I do surgery. It
yeah.
doesn't matter to me where the patient came from. It's a case." And so he got lambasted like, oh my God, that means you're super racist because you're saying that because you don't even know how racist you are. And so perversely, so Bauschner came out and said, look, I know Livingston. He's a great guy. He's not racist, blah, blah, blah. So they're like, oh my God, Bauschner, you're doubly racist because you're defending it. And so they went after both of them. They hounded them. I swear to God. And they both had to resign. Um, and
I
so,
mean, that's terrible, isn't it? If you make them resign, you make them resign for being part of that whole um, huge con during COVID. If they were saying that we need masking, we need social distancing, then
yeah,
that's a reason for
but
them to
it's kind
resign.
of funny because
Being
they were worried
colourblind
about.
should not be a reason to resign.
I know that, but the irony is in the statement that Livingston made to me that he did not want to sow doubt in the public health establishment. Well, the establishment, as it were, is fickle, and
Yeah,
and then impaled you at its earliest moment. The public health establishment didn't stand up for you; you stood up for them. And when push came to shove, they did their intersectionality rock paper scissors and said, "Oh, George Floyd followers." They're throwing rocks and stones and whatever, and we have to pay attention to them more than we have to pay attention to your tender sensibilities. And frankly, I don't think Livingston is racist. Obviously, that's I mean, when you're doing an
of
exam,
course it's not. I mean, it's the opposite of racist to say that I'm not paying attention to colour. I'm paying attention to their health. That's the opposite of racist.
and so now
Um,
they want anti-racists who do only that, who only pay attention to that. It's like I don't
yeah.
know. Be careful what you wish for. You might get it. Anyway, I'm going to have to let you go for today. Thank you so much, Dan, for being on. People should follow you at Jupplandia, and you need a bigger X presence so we can follow you there as well. Thank you so much.
Cheers, Randy.